Second part to Chapter 3 of Bloodborne Pathogens, we are going to look at exposure to and transmission of bloodborne pathogens, and as well as personal protective equipment and OSHA standards. When we look at high-risk activities such as athletes or athletics, exposure incidents to bloodborne pathogens are increased. Exposure is defined as contact with blood or other potentially infectious bodily fluids or injection into the skin that are injected into the skin or mucous membranes. Unless we are handling blood on a daily basis, such as blood draws, the potential for exposure to bloodborne pathogens is minimal. When we look at exposure incidents, occur if an infected athlete's blood is transferred to the skin, eyes, nose, mouth, or other mucous membrane of another person. Just because we or an athlete that we work with or another individual that we work with is exposed to a bloodborne pathogen, it does not necessarily mean that transmission will occur. There is a process that the bloodborne pathogens has to go through in order to be transmitted effectively. When we look at this, the infected blood must actually enter an uninfected person's body via openings in the skin, eyes, nose, or mouth, and that pathogen also has to enter the bloodstream. Once it enters the bloodstream, the virus must attack and take over a healthy host to begin replicating. If it does not take over the host cell to begin replicating, then the full transmission is not complete. Let's look at OSHA and the OSHA standard in regards to bloodborne pathogens. When we look at the standard for bloodborne pathogens via OSHA, the standard was instituted to protect any employee, including exercise scientists, who have the potential to be exposed to bloodborne pathogens while on the job. These regulations were set forth to recommend specific procedures in order to prevent bloodborne pathogen exposure in the workplace. The standard also defines what to do if someone is exposed and an incident occurs in the workplace. The OSHA standards regulates our employers' actions regarding bloodborne pathogen training for employees, work practice controls, which are policies and procedures, employee medical history, and status reviews for transmissions. When we look at this OSHA standard, we know that these are all important in the workplace. It is the job of the employer that the employees get trained in bloodborne pathogen training and transmission. All employees must go through annual bloodborne pathogen training. The employer provides this training during work hours at no cost to the employee. This training includes information on bloodborne pathogens, exposure of bloodborne pathogens, how bloodborne pathogens are transmitted, and how to prevent bloodborne pathogens. You can see the full bloodborne pathogen regulation section of OSHA via the link on this slide. This is the number of the standard for that, or in that link, you can see that part number title, Occupational Safety and Health Standards, and it is subpart Z of the 1910 code, which discusses toxic and hazardous substances, in specific hepatitis B vaccine declination, which is mandatory if somebody does not want to get the vaccine. In order to prevent employees from bloodborne pathogens, we need to follow universal precautions. Universal precautions are standardized, sequenced actions utilized by us as the employee or the caretaker of an athlete when there could be transmission of bloodborne pathogens. Universal precautions include the use of personal protective equipment that we talked about before. And we know that personal protective equipment must be included in our facility's first aid kit. First aid equipment and personal protective equipment in this kit should include disposable gloves, face masks, gowns, protective eyewear, roller gauze and pads, breathing barriers, and hand sanitizer. We can see a whole list of items in this sample workplace first aid kit. When we look at universal precautions, before touching an individual, we have to take cautions to put on latex or nitrile type of gloves to protect ourselves from the blood or bodily fluids. When we are finished caring for the athlete or individual, we need to dispose of the bloody materials properly. If the materials such as gauze or bandages are saturated, we need to place them into a container such as the one pictured here, a biohazard container. This biohazard container is for materials such as saturated gauze, bandages, and other soiled items such as gloves, gowns, eyewear. Once you are finished with the first aid care, we need to carefully and properly remove our gloves. After removing our gloves, we need to wash our hands thoroughly after care. Even though we have gloves on, we need to wash our hands with soap and water. If soap and water is not available, then we should be using hand sanitizer until the next opportunity to wash our hands with soap and water. In addition to washing our hands after care, we need to clean the surfaces that may have been exposed to blood and other materials with commercial liquid disinfectant cleaning solutions that are known to destroy HIV, HBV, HCV, and other viruses and bacteria. If this is not available in your site, we can also use a solution of 9 parts bleach to 1 part water. Because the activation of our bleach loses its effectiveness in 24 hours, the solution, if we go this route, needs to be prepared daily. As one of your assignments this week, you will be asked to videotape yourself removing your gloves properly. This is how to properly remove your gloves. We need to make sure that at no time we touch the inside of our body with the soiled part of the gloves. Universal precautions, other than using biohazard containers and gloves, also include using breathing barriers in order to prevent transmission of bloodborne pathogens. Breathing barriers must be utilized only one time on an athlete when performing CPR. After one use, we need to dispose of the barrier appropriately in a biohazard container. If any of these events occurs that we need to use bloodborne pathogen equipment such as personal protective equipment, we need to report the exposure to our employer. We need to report the incident immediately to our employer or supervisor, and the employer should provide you with an immediate medical evaluation as well as any blood testing, counseling, and follow-up care that you may need.